So with that, what I wanted to do is, I think the best way, I'm trying to juggle a microphone, this slide, and my notes, so we'll see if this works here. I think the best place for me to start would be to talk about how I became involved in this issue. In 2002, I was working as a reporter at the Chicago Tribune. I was covering breaking news for the newspaper, shootings and court cases and really depressing things, and it was leaving me feeling really dark and depressed every night. I mean, it's not why I wanted to become a journalist, to write about things that were not making the world any better. So I decided one day to go out leafleting with a group of activists on a campaign against a laboratory called Huntington Life Sciences. And we went out and passed out leaflets in a neighborhood, and that's all we did. No protests, no civil disobedience, nothing. We were arrested. Of course, the charges were later dismissed, but the important part of that story for me was that 2 weeks later I was visited by the FBI, and they threatened to put me on a domestic terrorist list unless I helped them infiltrate animal rights and environmental groups. So this was really shocking for me, and an experience to learn how so soon after September 11th, just 5 months after September 11th, someone who was leafleting could be threatened with the domestic terrorist list because of doing that. So it really became the start of an obsession for me to find out how this could happen so soon after September 11th. And then in the coming years, some very close friends of mine would be convicted as terrorists and sent to prison as well. So in the last 10 years, I've been focused almost exclusively in my work on state repression, and specifically with the animal rights and environmental movements. And now, as you'll see in this presentation, how these tactics are being shifted to other movements as well. According to the FBI, the animal rights and environmental movements are the #1 domestic terrorism threat. Is everyone able to see okay as we're getting started? Kind of? A little bit? Okay. They use this rhetorically in congressional hearings, government reports, and in the media. There's no official list of what is the top list of terrorism threats. However, by listing things like on the FBI website, having Osama bin Laden alongside an animal rights activist, it sends the very clear message of what the government's priorities are. Before we continue with the presentation, though, I would like to talk very briefly about what is not the #1 domestic terrorism threat. When I arrived in Hamburg yesterday, we went straight from the airport to the anti-fascist protests and the blockades that were taking place all over the city. The right-wing movement in the United States is a bit different because they do not have typically those kinds of public protests and gatherings. They're involved in more underground and illegal activity instead. For instance, Joseph Stacks is a man who flew a plane into the IRS building in my hometown of Austin, Texas, in protest of government tax policy. This is the Huttery militia that consider themselves to be Christian warriors, and they believe a holy war is coming. As you can see, that they're heavily armed. Members of the group were arrested on charges of plotting to kill government officials and to create weapons of mass destruction. This is Ralph Nicoletti. He and a group of friends went out on the election night of President Barack Obama, and they had batons, pipes, and clubs, and they beat African Americans who they perceived as voting for the first black president. They also ran over a white man with their car because they thought he had voted for Barack Obama as well. This is a listing by the National Abortion Federation of all the crimes committed by anti-abortion extremists and Christian fundamentalists. On this list are murders, attempted murders, bombings, death threats, anthrax threats, kidnapping, hostages, and many other crimes. All types of crimes that the animal rights and environmental movements have never committed. With the growth of the Tea Party in the United States, are people familiar with this term, Tea Party? Someone? It's kind of the new form of so-called grassroots right-wing movement in the United States. there's been an increase in violent rhetoric, not just with signs like this that say "we came unarmed this time," but with carrying assault rifles to protest. Think for a moment at the end of this presentation how the government would respond if animal rights activists carried assault weapons to public demonstrations. And finally, along with this Tea Party, there have been calls for outright property destruction and violence. This is an example from a right-wing militia leader who urged his followers to break windows at the political offices of politicians. This was all in protest of a health care bill. So in the United States, it was extremely controversial that people wanted to provide health care to some people who did not have it. And the right wing encouraged violence over this. None of these crimes were labeled as terrorism in the press or by the government. And according to some government officials, even the most dangerous and violent crimes against the government are not terrorism as well. This is Timothy McVeigh. He was responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed hundreds of people. According to a former Homeland Security director, Timothy McVeigh is not a terrorist, just very angry with the U.S. government. Quote, "Whether a person is a terrorist or a criminal is irrelevant to me." This is the message that we will hear throughout this evening. These are not isolated cases. These are institutional policies of the government. The right wing is not listed on national security threats by Homeland Security or by the FBI. In researching the book, I went through every FBI report from the 80s to the current day, and right-wing groups are continuously absent. So now let's talk about what is the #1 domestic terrorism threat. This is Earth First, which our host this evening, I think, is representing on his T-shirt tonight. They do things in the United States like blockade roads. This was a lecture tour where they did lectures all over the country, and then at the end of the tour, they tipped over their van and blocked the road to keep bulldozers from taking down old-growth forests. This is the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. They do things like steer small inflatable boats between Japanese whalers' harpoons and the whales to stop them from being murdered. They also do things, other forms of direct action to stop the killing of seals in Canada. They're active all over the world. Through WikiLeaks, we learned that the Japanese government put pressure on the United States to label Sea Shepherd a terrorist organization. This is an example I added yesterday because after talking to people I didn't know, some people might not have heard about it. In Green Hill, Italy, not too long ago, there were mass protests, public protests, and then at a vivisection facility where they were breeding beagle puppies to be used in experiments. So there were thousands of people there, and then in the course of the protest, they decided to literally tear down the barricades and climb over them and rescue the beagles from the facility. And then you can see here, lifting the beagles over the barbed wire to other activists. So this is not technically lawful protest activity, but it's also not something like the Animal Liberation Front. The Animal Liberation Front is completely clandestine and underground. And they do things like break into laboratories at night with masks covering their faces, stealing animals from the laboratories to rescue them, breaking into fur farms and releasing animals. At the most extreme have been crimes by the Earth Liberation Front, such as burning down Vail Ski Resort. These crimes have been incredibly destructive and caused millions of dollars of lost profits from corporations. But nowhere in any of these crimes has a human being ever been injured by the animal rights or environmental movements. So, how did we get to this point where civil disobedience is being labeled as terrorism in the United States, but actually murdering people by right-wing groups is not? To answer that question, I turned to the most notorious era of government repression in U.S. history, of the Red Scare of the 20s and also the 1940s and 50s. And during that period, there was a widespread attack on anyone perceived as being a communist or a dissident. It's striking how similar and how little these tactics have changed throughout US and world history. And these tactics have been the same throughout periods of history and actually across international borders as well. So what I wanted to do with the rest of the presentation is to step back a little bit and look at how this happened in the United States. And the hope is with, the reason for me being here and to go on this tour is to share this information so we can start connecting strategies in other countries as well and recognize how corporations are using these tactics around the world. So this is not literally a 10-step, one after another. Sometimes these are all happening together, but I thought this would be a useful way of talking about these things. The first step is to use the power of language. In the early 1980s, in the early 1980s, animal rights and environmental movements were growing rapidly in the United States, and they had widespread public support. They were becoming increasingly radical in their tactics and in their rhetoric, and most of the American public supported them. This is an example from 1986, a front-page story in one of the most important newspapers in the country, asking whether environmental warriors were using radical tactics to make their point. You would never see something like this today. In the newsletters of groups like PETA from 1985, you have here an Animal Liberation Front raid, one of the most famous in U.S. history, was used by PETA in their above-ground lawful campaigns. They did a press conference about it. Down here, you can't see it very well, but it asks why people conduct illegal direct action. So in all aspects of society, you had people talking about these tactics in a very different way. So it was important for corporations to find a way to shift public opinion. And the way they did that was to use the power of language. They shifted the discussion from labeling people as monkey wrencher or saboteur or even just a criminal to creating a new word called eco-terrorism. Over the next 20 years, they have used this word relentlessly until we get to this point of the #1 domestic terrorism threat. The second step is critical with this power of language, and that's to use media campaigns. Here's an example of how this works. As soon as individuals are arrested and charged with terrorism, they're immediately labeled as terrorists through press releases, such as this one in the top. And before people set foot in the courtroom, the mainstream press uses those press releases and regurgitates them almost exactly, talking about eco-terrorists have been arrested. So before you even have your day in court, you've already been labeled a terrorist. Immediately shifted public opinion against you. This was an example from 1986 that I found in my research of the Fur Commission taking out newspaper ads, and they say, "Meet the world's newest terrorist, animal rights activists." Now, in the U.S., this is really funny because this person looks like a TV show character named Steve Urkel. Does anyone know? So, yeah, kind of. You see, he looks exactly like that. Or he kind of looks like hipsters today in Brooklyn. They do, the really big glasses. And anyway, so 1986 to 2006, nothing has changed. They're using all the same tactics after September 11th in a new way, because now they have a new opportunity to use that terrorism rhetoric and it has more power. As you can see, this is one of my favorite examples because they don't always do their research. This animal rights terrorist is wearing a leather jacket. This appeared in the Washington Post, USA Today, and New York Times. Those are three of the most expensive media markets in the country. Another example of this propaganda campaign is how absurd it can be. When this movie came out, it's a children's movie in which the children vandalize bulldozers because they're trying to save this owl. It's a very popular kids' book. when it came out, you had a group called the Center for Consumer Freedom call it, quote, soft core eco-terrorism for kids. You know, we laugh at these things, but the press repeated it. National newspapers had articles about this. This is another newspaper ad in which an organization compares the Humane Society, which is frequently challenged in the animal rights movement as being too mainstream, not radical enough. They're trying to connect them to terrorists through this flowchart here. The quick summary is that someone from the Humane Society was at a holiday party where someone with another group was there, and that person worked at another group called Hugs for Puppies. And that group previously worked on the Huntington Life Sciences campaign, and some members of that campaign were convicted as terrorists. Therefore, the Humane Society is a terrorist organization. And this is an image from the National Rifle Association. In their internal publication, now I hope people can see this, because we see now the true threat of the animal rights movement is that they're teaching lobsters to crawl on land. They're teaching birds to carry dynamite. And, obviously most dangerously, none of the women shave their legs. The third step is to hold government hearings. Now, it's not always important that these hearings are at the same level as during the Red Scare. You remember the House Un-American Activities Committee hearings, where people were asked, are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? It doesn't have to be the same, because what these hearings do is politicians say, we're going to ask, is eco-terrorism a threat to the United States? This was this hearing here. Is eco-terrorism a threat? What do you think their answer is by the end of the hearing? Of course eco-terrorism is a threat. We have all these witnesses talking about eco-terrorism being a threat. So the point of these hearings is that they help legitimize the idea of eco-terrorism and help legitimize the threat. Because when the government holds a hearing like this, you have newspapers and reporters and TV shows that will talk about this because it's officially government business. Does that make sense? It helps institutionalize it and make it more of a national priority. The fourth step here is to divide the movement. Now, excuse me for being a little nerdy here with this graphic, but I think it's very helpful to think of things in this graph way, of having social movements have both a horizontal and a vertical component. So horizontally, you have the animal rights movement alongside other leftist movements. Anti-war activists, anti-fascists, anti-racist activists, women's rights activists, all together. What corporations and the government have done is to prevent the animal rights and environmental movements from being seen as part of the broader left. Now, sometimes these movements have helped that by not being willing to form alliances and saying things that are damaging to other movements, or saying things that are racist or imperialist, things like that. But most importantly, this has been a tactic by corporations and politicians. They emphasize, you don't want to be like those environmentalists or those radical animal rights activists. They want to make sure that you can't eat anything you want. You can't take your children to the circus. You can't go to the zoo. You can't drive a car. You can't buy anything made out of paper. It's this kind of crazy rhetoric that to show how radical these movements are and how they're not part of the, traditional left. At the same time, you have movements that they're broken apart vertically. So the above ground groups like Greenpeace, Humane Society, are separated from the underground groups like Animal Liberation Front, Earth Liberation Front, even Earth First, Sea Shepherd, groups like that. The way they do this is actually politicians sent out a letter to every environmental group. And they said, you either need to decide you're with us or you're with the terrorists. You need to disavow and condemn so-called radical tactics. or we will investigate you and take away your tax status, your nonprofit status. So by doing this, when you have above ground distance itself from the underground, you have the regular left distance itself from the animal rights and environmental movements, you have people that are isolated. And when you're isolated, it allows government repression to proceed much more intensely and rapidly. And that's what's happened in the United States. The fifth step is to conduct surveillance. This is obvious to everyone, right? The government does spy on activists. I don't think most people are aware the extent to which this has happened in the United States and in other countries. For instance, this happened in the UK. You all are familiar with Mark Kennedy or Mark Stone, correct? He was a police officer who went undercover in the environmental movement for years. You can see him here as a cop and as an anarchist environmentalist. He had sexual relationships with some of the activists. He fathered children with some activists. As I understand it, he even attempted to travel to other countries, including Germany, to meet with activist groups.
He wanted to come to our Congress.
I didn't know if we could say that or not. Okay. So, yeah, he went to the conference I mentioned, the Anti-Repression Congress 2 years ago. He tried to come to that, the one where we were all there. So this is one example. They use informants and infiltrators. In the United States, in the last month, there have been 2 examples of FBI agents doing exactly this, infiltrating the Occupy Wall Street movement, and they've done this for a long time with environmentalists, and to attempt to get them to do illegal activity. In this case, it's been to throw Molotov cocktails. Now, the activists never did anything like that, but the government did everything they could to make them do it, and then arrested them as terrorists. In other words, the government is manufacturing the terrorism threat it is helping to solve. Does that make sense? Here's another example. This is a document I just got last week. This is from the counterterrorism unit of my book, which is available for sale. And I was telling Christian last night, this is really disturbing to see things like this, and it's terrifying sometimes. But it's also very funny because one of the quotes they say as they're writing about my book is that it's, quote, compelling and well written. So, great. So please buy a book. Also, when I was on tour in the U.S., I did about 30 lectures, and at multiple lectures, the FBI were there, and they would even come in and show their badges as they were walking in to show that they are surveilling people. Sometimes they do this openly, and the intention is to intimidate, is to make people afraid. I mean, think about if law enforcement walked in and said, "Hey, we're counterterrorism units." How would you all feel about that? I mean, it makes people more quiet during the discussion. It makes me pissed off, but I keep talking and I have to do my talk. But that's the intention. The sixth step is to turn informants and snitches. People know what these terms are, right? Snitches and informants?
Snitch, no.
Snitch, no. Snitch is a less nice way of saying informant. It's very loaded. It's a very derogatory term. A snitch is someone who turns on...
Spitzer.
What's that?
Spitzer in German, I think.
Spitzer?
Right?
No. I can't say. Someone who turns on their friends, turns them into the government, provides information, wears a wire when they talk to them. This has been absolutely crucial to every successful prosecution in the United States of these activists. I think we need to really emphasize this. This is Jacob Ferguson. In the largest arrest of environmentalists in U.S. history of the Earth Liberation Front, he was absolutely critical. According to the FBI, that case would not have been possible in any way without his cooperation. He is a heroin addict, a drug addict. the government found out about this, and they said, we will send you to prison unless you help us by providing information about activists. Much like, remember what they said to me at the start of this presentation. Well, he didn't want to go to prison for his drug charges, so he agreed to wear a microphone secretly, talk to people he had known over the years. The government had no idea that he was actually the most active arsonist in the entire environmental movement in the history of the United States. Purely by accident, they found out about him. And he turned informant, or snitch, and led to all these arrests. It's become so pervasive that I would call it a snitch model, or informant model of police work. Because it happens the same way every time. You find someone, you grab Matthias here, you say, well, I know you were at this Antifa protest, I saw you throw bottles, we know something, and then it makes you afraid. They don't, you don't know if they actually have information about you or not. So you think, maybe I need to help them so I don't go to prison. The government takes that information and says, Christian, we heard from Matthias, we know a little bit about you. Christine, we heard from Christian, we know a little bit about this. All of a sudden, all of this has come together. And without people talking like that, and not to say that any of these people would do that, I just like to pick on them. That's how these cases are built. The next step is to hire what I would call mercenary counterterrorism corporations. This is an example of how all of these terrorism priorities really take a life of their own. So here's a very common example in the US. The state governments want to get this terrorism money from the national government. There's millions of dollars available to fight terrorists. So to get that, they have to show that there are terrorists in their state. So for instance, in Texas, my home state, state officials submitted all this documentation identifying over 100 different types of terrorist groups. And by doing that, they help get the government money. Well, to make these reports, they hire these counterterrorism firms. And think about it. If you worked at a counterterrorism corporation and someone was paying you, 200,000 euro to identify terrorist threats, what are you going to say in your report? Are you going to come back and say, no terrorists anywhere? No. Of course you're going to identify plenty of terrorists. This happened in Pennsylvania, where the company came back and said, oh yes, there are terrorists everywhere, including environmentalists who are doing things like protesting gas drilling, natural gas, it's called fracking. I don't know if you know this term. Some of the things they talked about were environmentalists having film screenings. They were showing documentary movies about this practice, and that was listed as a terrorism threat. The eighth step is really becoming the culmination of all of these efforts, and that's to pass new legislation labeling political activists as terrorists. Now, during the Red Scare in the United States, there were things like the Smith Act, which targeted anyone who, and this is a quote from the legislation, prints, publishes, edits, issues, circulates, sells, distributes, or publicly displays any printed material advocating, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of revolution. This is everyone. So these new laws are a bit different, though. Like new laws like the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act were literally created by these corporations. All of them that are pictured here. I think many of them you might know, like Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, Covance, Wyeth, right? Some of these. The beef industry, the dairy industry. All of them, of course, have a political interest in silencing animal rights activists and environmentalists. This new law is so broad that it labels nonviolent civil disobedience as terrorism. The first people arrested under the law were arrested for doing things like chanting with bullhorns and protesting with masks over their faces. This is very common in the United States because And much like I'm sure here, people do not like to be photographed by the FBI and by other groups, so they cover their faces. Now, in the last 2 years, or since I was here last time, the situation has gotten even worse. There are now states that have passed new laws that go so far as to specifically criminalize undercover investigators. This is not the Animal Liberation Front. This is nothing like that. These are mainstream organizations that go into factory farms with their video camera and take photographs of animals like this being abused. That is it. That's all they are accused of. These states are trying to pass new laws, in some cases labeling that as terrorism, in other cases to specifically outlaw, including journalists, who go onto a factory farm and to take photographs. This is obviously a concern not just for animal rights activists, but for people like me. People who are actually engaged in doing critical journalism and taking photographs and things like this. You see here is a map that shows both where some of these investigations have taken place recently, and the highlighted states are the ones that have considered this legislation. Now, most of them are up here. You can see Missouri, there's a direct relationship. Iowa, where the most investigations have been taking place, is one of the 3 states that has passed one of these new laws. And you can see why. All those industries are based there. In the US, we call these ag-gag bills. Ag for agriculture and gag for silencing them. In my research for the book, I also uncovered this document through a friend of mine. This was dated in 2003, so long before these new laws. And it says that the FBI is considering terrorism charges against nonviolent undercover investigators. This is something that I've warned about for years. When I testified before Congress, this is one of the ways that I said that we should not pass this new law because it can be used in this way. All the while, the FBI was already doing this. I can't emphasize enough how devious this is, that the FBI has been lying publicly for years, while all this time investigating undercover investigators as terrorists. This is Tim DeChristopher. He disrupted an oil and gas lease auction by corporations. He stood up. He was a college student at the university, and he had a bidder's paddle. Do you know this term? He had a document he raised in the air to say, I will purchase this land for $100,000, right? And then they say, oh, does anyone want to pay $200,000? And he'd say, okay, I pay $200,000. You know this auction? He had no money. He knew this. It was brilliant. He kept doing it. He inflated this price by millions of dollars. And the corporations were not happy about this. This auction was later ruled by the government as being illegal. Okay? Corporations did not have a right to buy the land this way. Nevertheless, Tim DeChristopher is now in prison for 2 years in federal prison because of his civil disobedience. Also, after this this action, there were new laws introduced trying to label what he did as terrorism. The next step is to create special prison units for domestic terrorists. This is a relatively new development in the United States. Everyone is familiar with Guantanamo Bay, right? So this is separate from Guantanamo. And this is actually on U.S. soil in the United States. There are 2 facilities that are called communications management units. The government says they are for, quote, second-tier terrorists. Second important terrorists. They overwhelmingly imprison Muslims and Arab people, over 70%. A small portion of them are also environmentalists and animal rights activists and political prisoners. This is Daniel McGowan. a friend of mine who is currently in the communications management unit in Illinois. There's now lawsuits challenging these as unconstitutional and inhumane. He is not allowed any contact visit with his friends or family. He is not allowed to hug his wife, not allowed to hug his niece or nephews. I visited him, and I write about this in the book. The government threatened that if I talk about this interview, they would make it even more extreme for him. I can't even emphasize how surreal of an experience it is. You know, we're separated by bulletproof glass, and there are small cameras where our conversation is being live monitored by the counterterrorism unit, which is part of the reason that you saw my book and other things were in these documents. The final step is to repeat. And I don't mean to be a smartass by saying it like this, but if there's one lesson we have learned from every era of government repression in U.S. history and in world history is that when people in power single out individuals because of their political beliefs, they never, ever stop with one group. It always expands to other forms and other groups on the left or other dissidents. This group, this framework has worked its way into every level of government. The Department of Agriculture lists PETA as a terrorism threat. Last week, I got these documents from the FBI. This is from a training presentation where the FBI instructs FBI agents about the nature of the animal rights and environmental movements. I hope you can see some of this because it's quite good. They say this is a public relations war. The media is vital to every activist campaign. And the media is sometimes slanted in favor of the activists. I'm sure you all who have been involved in protests, you know that's not often the case, but sometimes the media is on your side, right? And also the activists spin the truth. This is how FBI agents are being trained. This has really worked its way into every level of government. This is from a similar presentation about anarchists. I think most important here is that the FBI says anarchists are merely, quote, criminals seeking an ideology to justify their activities. Think about this. Across the board, every anarchist is simply a criminal who is looking for a belief system. If this sounds outrageous, it's become the norm. In multiple court cases now, activists have had the government say in court that, you know, this person is a terrorist because he is an outspoken anarchist. The government has even said that as they have raided someone's home, they raided a friend of mine's home, they found anarchist books. They also found Marxist books and all kinds of different books, whatever. They hold up these anarchist books and say, this is what we found in his house, therefore he is a domestic terrorist. Homeland Security is training its agents to prepare for armed resistance by animal rights and environmental groups. Now, if the FBI itself has warned against these policies, the FBI has a division called the Inspector General. And the Inspector General evaluates and is supposed to oversee the FBI, right? The Inspector General says, we believe that the FBI's priority mission of preventing terrorist attacks would be enhanced if the agency did not spend time and resources on social protesters. This is the FBI itself saying this. And the FBI wrote back and said, no. These are our policies. These are the top terrorism threat. Now things have changed a little bit in the United States with the growth of the Occupy movement. I wrote about this. I don't know where it went. This issue that we have for free of the Hintergrund, and it's in German. And they were nice to donate a lot of copies for free. So if you'd like a copy, please get one. It's about many of the issues I talked about today. And if you would like this, perhaps if you could make a donation, would be really great as well. So this, to me, is really representative of why I've done this work, because we see the expansion of terrorism powers to other social movements. In my work, I make this analogy to the Red Scare, because to me it's been very useful in understanding how government repression operates. But in many ways, this analogy isn't completely accurate. After September 11th, things have changed. It's not the same model of government repression. On the left, and especially in universities and academic circles, we talk about state repression, right? It's repression by the state, by the government. I would argue that there's been a profound shift in how this operates. And I would go so far as to call it more of a corporate repression. Corporations are what are driving all of this. It's this desire to protect corporate interests and capital. It's not the state repression as the left has historically conceptualized it. So, in the Green Scare, corporations have created this term eco-terrorism. They've done the public relations. They've done the lobbying. They've done the passed new legislation, passed new court cases. They've done all of this. At every step of the way, the police and politicians have merely been a third party, right? They've been surrogates to carry out the corporate agenda. It's not that they're necessarily creating this on their own. It's been guided every step of the way by corporations, either by explicitly telling them what to do, or by politicians understanding that for them to be successful, they need to support corporate interests and corporate capitalism. I think this is a really important point, because corporations, by extension, have no national boundary, right? Capital has no boundaries. It moves all over the world wherever money can be made. This is the simplistic idea of the global neoliberalism, right? Open borders, open markets. And when you have open borders, open markets, it sets the stage for exporting government repression to different countries and using the same types of tactics. This has happened with the United States, these tactics being exported to many other countries. And it's also happened with some of the government repression in other countries showing up in the United States. So what does this mean for us? If this repression cannot be confined to one country or to one movement or to one period of history, what does that mean? I mean, I don't mean to say this in a really depressing way. But I think there is importance to recognize this and see government repression as a continuum. Does this word make sense? So it's always there. It always exists. Sometimes it goes up and down based on how successful the movement is. But repression is a constant. It will always be there. It has always been there. With every successful radical movement has been met with this type of repression. Now, I think in saying this, some people can hear that and be very depressed and say, oh, what is the point? It's always been this way. There's no point in fighting the corporations and capitalism and the state. It's too powerful. But I think it can be really empowering. Because to me, in working on this book and seeing how all of this works, it helps to dissect it and to see that the people that are doing this, they're not smarter than any of us. They're not more dedicated than any of us. The tactics they are using have been used before. Now they use them in a different way now. But there's nothing about them that is inevitable. There's nothing inevitable about this repeating itself. Oh no. Excuse me for this awkward pause. So, in conclusion, I think it's really useful to make these comparisons to other eras of government repression. But ultimately, that analogy with the Red Scare has to stop when change begins. Dostoevsky had one of my favorite lines ever in the Notes from the Underground, where he says, "The whole work of man is to determine that he is a man and not a piano key." Does this make sense? I think we need to take that to heart. Just because we're hit with the same tactics as many other eras of government repression, and we're feeling the same forces, we do not have to respond in the same note. Just because we are played this way, we don't have to play the same tune in response. We are not piano keys. We are capable of more, and I think by sharing information between countries and between movements, we can build a popular movement to fight back against this. So thank you all so much for having me here and coming out tonight, and I look forward to talking to you with questions and comments if you have any. Thank you.